Welcome back to the IGDORE Open Science Meetup. As you know, I'm Etienne, and today I'll be talking about a platform we're building called Curate Science, crowdsourcing the credibility of empirical research. And as I just said, please feel free to interrupt for clarification questions. We'll keep substantive comments till the end. And so the goals of science are to advance theory and deepen our understanding of how our world actually works. But then we try to use this deepened understanding to try to solve important societal problems such as social problems and medical problems. However, to achieve these goals, these scientific findings must be credible. But what makes a published finding credible? Richard Feynman had some ideas, the Nobel laureate physicist. And it's a long quote, but it's actually worth reading. So he said, if you're doing an experiment, you should report everything that you think might make it invalid. Not only what you think is right about it, but other causes that could possibly explain your results. Details that could throw doubt on your interpretation must be given if you know them. You must do the best you can if you know anything at all wrong or possibly wrong. To explain it. If you put out a theory, for example, then you must also put down all of the facts that disagree with it, as well as those that agree with it. In summary, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to a judgment in one particular direction or another. In other words, to evaluate the credibility of a published finding, it needs to be reported with sufficient transparency, but then we can start thinking about what does sufficient transparency look like. And this is critical because sufficient transparency allows independent researchers to ruthlessly scrutinize a study's methods and data to identify design flaws and data reporting errors. And also, sufficient transparency is critical to be able to conduct replication attempts. And then, if a finding survives such scrutiny, that is, independent researchers fail to identify fatal study design flaws, fail to identify data processing errors or statistical errors, or result fragilities, and also fail to identify replicability issues, then and only then can a finding be temporarily retained as not yet proven false, and hence treated as credible. In other words, sufficient transparency maximizes falsifiability. And so falsifiability was popularized by Karl Popper, though the ideas were around before. And falsifiability is a notion that for a scientific hypothesis, it must be possible to prove it wrong. And this is very counterintuitive because humans typically tend to prove things right. They try to prove themselves right. And so proving a hypothesis wrong means it must be possible to conceive of observations that could refute a hypothesis. So that means setting up an experiment such that if you observe certain data, it would force you to change your belief. So for example, you say, if the hypothesis is true, we expect these set of results. If it's false, we expect these other distinct set of results. Right? Then you do the study, and it has to be possible to be able to observe these refuting data points. And we have a paper called Falsifiability is Not Optional, refuting some anti-open science rhetoric by the status quo in social psychology. Because I'm not going to get into the demarcation criterion, which Popper was also known for, but this is contested in the philosophy of science, but basically the idea is that if you're testing hypotheses that are not falsifiable, you're not even doing science. You're doing pseudoscience. And so falsifiability is really not optional if you want scientific programs to be possible. However, falsifiability is not black and white, even though the picture is black and white. There are 50 shades of falsifiability, or what Popper called different degrees of falsifiability. And so, for instance, High falsifiability would mean it's highly likely to prove a false hypothesis wrong, whereas low falsifiability would mean that it's highly unlikely to prove a false hypothesis wrong, or near impossible. And so this is very abstract, so to try to concretize things a little bit, you can conceive of falsification attempts as cannons. And so in this case, we have a very strong-looking, violent cannon that is launching violent cannonballs towards hypothesis bricks. And if your cannonballs fail to destroy the hypothesis bricks, then you can infer that those bricks are sturdy, they're solid. But this can be contrasted with wimpy falsification attempts, whereby you have a wimpy cannon launching wimpy cannonballs towards hypothesis bricks. And so if the bricks withstand the falsification attempt, then you haven't really learned much about the sturdiness of the bricks. And so to recap, sufficient transparency is required for falsifiability. Higher levels of transparency afford higher levels of falsifiability. And the more scrutiny a published finding survives, the more credible it can be considered. And there are at least 3 fundamental dimensions in which a published study need to be scrutinized. And that would be method data transparency, which is the extent to which the methods and data were transparently reported. Analytic reproducibility and robustness, which is the ability to repeat the same statistical analyses on the original data and confirm that you can reproduce the results that were reported in the paper. And then effect replicability is the ability for independent researchers to repeat a study in a new sample of participants or specimens using similar methodologies and be able to consistently observe the same result. As a brief example before we get into the Curate Science demonstration, I want to talk about a concrete example, which is BEM's controversial ESP studies. And so BEM actually reported 9 studies reporting positive evidence for the paranormal phenomena of ESP, which is actually an umbrella term for different phenomena, but one is precognition. Precognition, so you actually showed that humans could predict the future at better than chance rate, and he also showed what he called a retroactive recall effect, which is that participants were able to show enhanced memory for words rehearsed after a memory test, right? And so in a standard memory paradigm, participants are shown words that are told to be memorized, then they're given a recall test, and then after the test, they were given the opportunity to rehearse half of those words, and BEM was able to show that participants' memory for rehearsed words was enhanced compared to non-rehearsed words, even though the rehearsal occurred after the test, right? Suggesting that somehow studying for an exam was able to basically boost your performance on the exam retroactively. So basically going back in time, which violates the laws of physics. And this was published in Social Psychology's most prestigious journal, Journal Personality and Social Psychology. And it was peer-reviewed by 4 expert reviewers who could not find any fatal flaws with any of the 9 studies. And BEM conducted and reported the research according to the standards at the time, 2010. And actually, in many ways, he exceeded. This is why it was so important, right? Because, of course, he researched in a poor manner and published it in a no-name journal. It could have just been ignored, right? But because he exceeded the research standards at the time, social psychologists were put between a rock and a hard place, right? They either had to believe that humans can predict the future, which is basically near impossible, because then you could bankrupt most casinos, or conclude that our research standards, writ large, are fatally deficient, right? And so both of those were very difficult to swallow. But I was in grad school at the time, and we had been suspecting problems with our research standards for a long time, and this was basically a vindication that our research standards were too low. And so the point of using this example is that it's most likely, Ben is most likely testing a false hypothesis. Because of course in science we never know the truth, but paranormal studies are often used as a control group for science. Because it's not impossible, right? Nothing is impossible. You always have to be open-minded as a scientist. But in this case, it's most likely a false hypothesis. And so now we can look at the extent to which BEM's studies were transparently reported according to newer standards that have emerged since then. And so we're going to talk about 4 different aspects of transparency. The first is the methodological details. And BEM actually reported his studies using the accepted standards at the time, and so they appeared seemingly fully reported, but they actually can be considered opaque according to new reporting standards.
Were these studies made to prove a point, or was it serious?
No, it was dead serious. So I mean, BEM had studied paranormal. I mean, BEM is actually a famous social psychologist who contributed serious research to social psychological theory. But then he started becoming more interested in paranormal phenomena and believed in it because he had personal experiences. He saw anecdotal evidence in other friends and then started reading the literature and was convinced it was true. And then he set out to empirically prove it's true, which is, again, the opposite of the scientific method, but that's how he was trained and that's how we were trained in social psychology. And so there's no evidence that he falsified data or fabricated data. Like, it's a genuine good faith attempts using the methodology and the training that he was trained to do research. And he's even admitted in interviews that it's not a hoax, because a lot of people thought it was a hoax, right? To kind of prove that social psychology is just a joke, but definitely not. So now we've pushed for new reporting standards, which we'll get into in the demonstration. And Surya mentioned Penelope, which is actually automating the process of checking whether papers actually comply to official reporting guidelines, which are kind of checklists of, like, for different kinds of studies, you have to report these 20 methodological items. Because if you don't have those details, then again, you have insufficient information to critique and scrutinize a study. And so BEM studies would not pass this very basic reporting standard. And then you can look at experimental material. So these are all of the stimuli and materials that a researcher would need to do replication. To BEM's credit, he was forthright in sharing his experimental materials upon request. However, they were not made publicly available. And so making your experimental materials publicly available in a public repository, again, maximizes falsifiability, because now there's a larger set of eyes that can look at the stimuli, not only to find design flaws, but to actually conduct replication intent. And then pre-registration is another practice which already existed in medicine, but it was slow to be introduced in psychology, though after this crisis, a lot of people started proposing that psychology studies should also pre-register, meaning that you write a method protocol that specifies how are you going to collect data, how are you going to analyze the data prior to collecting the data. Then you submit it to a registry which is frozen in time and cannot be edited, and so that when you report your results, you can link back to the pre-registered protocol, and then reviewers and the community can ensure that you did actually follow what you said you were going to do. And this is critical for distinguishing exploratory from confirmatory analyses, and also, again, just for better scrutinizing potential flaws, multiple comparisons, outcome switching, which is a big problem where you have many outcomes and then you just report the one that gives the best result. So again, we can't really fault Daryl Ben for not having pre-registered studies, because no one did that in psychology. But again, pre-registration increases falsifiability. And finally, data files availability. So again, he deserves credit. He was very, well, eventually, not initially, but eventually he did share all of his data files with certain researchers. But they were not publicly available, which lowers falsifiability. And if they were publicly available at the time of submission, then the peer reviewers could actually look at the data and found some problems. And so, for example, I'm not actually going to go into the reproducibility part, but this is actually a recent email exchange between Daryl Ben and Uli Shumak, who's a ruthless skeptic at the University of Toronto. And so Daryl Ben sent him The data files, and remember I said there was 9 studies. So Daryl then reported 9 studies showing positive evidence for these different paranormal effects. But then when Schumack looked at the data, it actually turns out that each data sets were comprised of different samples that had been combined in ad hoc ways. So for example, study 6 comprised a study of 91 participants and then 19 participants in a different sample, and then 40 participants. So that totaled 100. And in the original paper, it just said 100 Cornell undergraduates participated. Right? But then once the data was shared, and actually it was even unclear, Yuli Schumack couldn't even actually match up the numbers. So the numbers didn't actually even match up. So the number of participants participating in the different studies didn't match up the actual samples that were combined and never reported. Right? And again, this is not fraud. It was just we were trained to give the best impression of our data. Right? Don't tell little details that might make your evidence less compelling. Right? Well, fraud is a very rare area. Right?
Intent.
You have to prove intent or malice, right? Intent to deceive.
It's rare.
But surely the intent is to present the best possible version of your work, as you said.
Right, but that's how we were trained. So yes, in some ways it could be considered, we now call it soft fraud. So there's kind of like a distinction between fraud and soft fraud. But again, from a transparency, falsifiability perspective, it actually doesn't matter if you intended to deceive or if you just screwed up, right? And made some mistakes that upon scrutiny will be detected. But you're right, I mean, there's a movement to try to basically call things that were just called QRPs to actually call them fraud. Anyways, and then finally, for study 6, when Uli Schumack repeated the same statistical analyses on the shared data, he couldn't even reproduce the result that was reported in the paper. So he had the script results, and Daryl Bem couldn't really explain. I'm going to skip this part, but as alluded, this effect, the retroactive recall effect, is most likely false. But at the time, psychologists actually decided, well, we're going to do replication attempts and see, because it's possible, but it's unlikely. And so independent replication attempts that match the exact methodologies of BEM. So this was basically about a 2-3% memory boost, and as you can see, the replications basically converge onto about 0 plus or minus some error, and the same with the different operationalization. So the summary is that sufficient transparency would have revealed cherry picking of samples, studies, items, and analyses, and then independent analytic reproducibility checks would have revealed data processing and analytic problems, and also further cherry picking of combining different samples in ways that gave him the most favorable evidence. And so the paper likely would have never been published if the peer reviewers and the broader community actually had access to this increased transparency. And even the replicators might have decided that's not worth their time, because doing replications is very costly and expensive. And so it's always about deciding what's worth spending resources on. But at the time, the results seemed very compelling, because again, they exceeded the research centers at the time. And the logical thing to do was not just to dismiss the result based on the topic. The logical thing to do was to attempt replication and say, well, let's see if it holds up. But now looking back, it seems a bit wasteful that we spent so many resources trying to replicate something that's so unlikely to be true. And so bringing back to Curate Science, our goal is to crowdsource the credibility of empirical research by curating these 3 fundamental falsifiability-related study characteristics. So again, method and data transparency, the extent to which the methods and data were transparently reported, analytic reproducibility, which is the extent to, that one can reproduce the reported results from the raw data by repeating the same analyses, and replicability is the ability to repeat the methodology in a new sample of participants in independent samples and consistently be able to observe the effect. And then again, the more scrutiny of published findings survives along these three dimensions, the more credible it can be considered. And so by curating this information, making it more accessible, easily discoverable, we can actually not just estimate credibility, but also further incentivize researchers to report their research more transparently. And as I said, our current focus is on developing a web platform and user interface to curate the method data transparency. So initially we focus on reproducibility, but we think that's kind of more of an ambitious down the road vision, and that the transparency is the current, much more tractable, worthwhile component of the three dimensions. Though they're all interrelated, but you need to start somewhere. And so now I'm going to give you a quick demo of the kind of the latest prototype that we've been working on, which is a platform to search for transparently reported studies.